Time now for Touch Base in Seoul, and we are very pleased today to be joined by a special guest, the Canadian ambassador to South Korea, the Honorable Eric Walsh, here in the studio. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know you've done interviews in the past here in Korea, both Korean language and English language media, and so many of our listeners may know your story. But from what I understand, you are a veteran diplomat, of course, but this particular posting, it wasn't necessarily an assignment. It was something that you requested. Could you just walk us through how you ended up in Korea?
Sure. Well, I'm really happy to be here, first of all. The process in Canada involves both sort of putting your name forward and then going through the rigorous process. Mm-hmm. So when I was actually at our mission in Berlin as the deputy ambassador there, and I saw that my posting was coming to an end and the embassy in Korea was going to be open. So I thought that would be a really good place for me to go. I had spent some time in Ottawa dealing with Korean Peninsula issues before. And I even did some work when I was in university on the North Korea nuclear issue. So that's how long ago people were thinking about that. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to come. We have the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement. We've got all these people-to-people ties. I thought it would be a really nice combination. And I'm really fortunate that my name made it all the way through the process, and I was selected to come here.
It's been about 3 years now, a little
right.
over 3 years. How would you describe your time so far?
It's really been a whirlwind. On the one hand, it feels like I just got here in some ways. And on the other hand, when I think back to, February 2015, so much has changed since then. Back when I arrived here, we were looking forward to the Olympics that were 3 years away. And now the Olympics and Paralympics are behind us. It's really, really hard to believe. But I would say that the experience of living in a city like Seoul has been the biggest surprise for me. The fact that it's such a huge city. I've never lived any place anywhere near this big, with all of the traffic and the public transportation, all the people, the food. It's just been almost overwhelming. And to me, that's the thing that I'll remember most about this place, is just the incredible size and scale of the city.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because from what I understand, you were born in London, Ontario, but you spent a lot of your life in Toronto. And for most people, they think of Toronto as this mega metropolis. My Canadian friends, when we're talking sports, always like to remind me, well, Toronto's a big market as well. And so you would think they're similar in scale, but I guess what you're saying is it's different, right?
It's, to me, like, I think Toronto's a big city, but Seoul, if you count the whole area around it, you're talking about 4 times the size and in terms of population, but also so much more dense in terms of the people per square meter.
Right.
In Toronto, there's lots of places you can go, and you can be in parks, and you can walk down river valleys, and you're really kind of on your own. In Seoul, it's really hard to find a place where you're on your own.
And there's probably some extent a bit of a cultural shock, and you try to acclimatize to the new environment. But of course, you're still doing the very important work of being the representative for your country. These 3 years, how would you describe the evolution of Canada-South Korea relations, especially with the domestic political upheaval that we witnessed in the past year?
Well, it's been interesting because when I first came here, obviously it was a different president here, different prime minister in Canada. But since the election of Moon Jae-in last year, we've had a very strong connection between the government and Canada. We had strong connections before as well, but just talking about the current situation. In fact, just so far this year, we're going to welcome our 4th minister's visit this week. And in some years in the past, there might be 1 or 2 ministers' visits an entire year. So there's just a lot more interactions, I think, between Korea and Canada now. And I'd like to take credit for that, but I think that's also just the reality. We have our free trade agreement. We have, hundreds of thousands of Koreans in Canada. We have tens of thousands of Canadians here in Korea.
Right.
The people-to-people links are what drives this relationship and makes it so strong. And that, to me, has been another great pleasure about this assignment, is all the wonderful people I've had a chance to meet.
Just touching on a couple of bilateral issues. Trade, first of all, we know that one country that is an important trade partner to your country, as well as here in Korea, the U.S., maybe moving to a bit more of a protectionist stance. How important do you think trade relations are with Canada and South Korea as you try to develop and expand trade in the midst of sort of a different global environment?
Yeah, well, I think Canada and Korea are 2 countries that both really gain our prosperity from our success in international trade. Korea is certainly producing consumer products that people all over the world want to buy. Canadians maybe a little more on the natural resources side, but also some high-end items as well. Both of us doing increasingly well with cultural industries, the Hallyu and some of the Canadian movies and television shows that are successful. I don't know if you heard of Kim's Convenience. It's a wonderful combination. It's actually a Canadian television show starring a Korean family that runs a convenience store in Toronto. And it's been a big success commercially as well. So I think we have to use our voices as Canadians, as Koreans, and as the two governments to stand up for the benefits of free trade, the benefits to consumers, the benefits to businesses, including small and medium-sized enterprises. It's not just the big giants that benefit from free trade. It's everybody. And we need to do a better job maybe of explaining that to people. In Canada, we've been talking about comprehensive and progressive trade agreements. And that's important for us, that it's not just, the traditional lowering the tariffs. It's also looking at some of the issues around that that'll hopefully get people to buy in to what we're trying to do and see how it benefits everybody.
When we talk about security and your extensive experience as a diplomat, I know you've been posted all around the world, including in Geneva. You mentioned Ottawa and the important work that you did there with landmines,
yes,
I believe.
Yeah.
And you minored in Russian, right, in university. So a lot of these are sort of coming full circle now with Russia looming large on certain national security concerns, North Korea as what you were studying with their nuclear development program, and this flurry of diplomatic activity that's been going on. How do you sort of view through your prism the security challenges here in South Korea and, of course, how it affects Canada?
Well, Canada's in some way privileged by our geography. We've got a large friendly neighbor to the south, and we've got oceans to the north, east, and west. But we have a lot of interest in the international global order and in making sure that we have a rules-based and predictable international framework. So we're very supportive. You mentioned I was at Geneva at the United Nations, very supportive of international disarmament efforts, Chemical Weapons Convention as well, for example, which is in the news lately. And that's where Canadians expect us to be. We have that benefit of geography, and so we have a responsibility to use that benefit to ensure that we are seen as a fair player, that we are calling it as we see it, and not using our position to advance our own national interests solely. When we look at some of the challenges these days, for diplomats, it's kind of a catch-22. On the one hand, you want to be involved in interesting issues. On the other hand, having a nice, quiet international order is also pretty beneficial. Sure. So certainly watching what's going on with the inter-Korean relations lately has been a real amazing change from where we were even 6 months ago. Right. And we're talking about, the summit that's coming up at the end of this month, talking about possibly a summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. We just saw Kim Jong-un in Beijing for his first summit with China. It's almost like there's too much going on at the moment. I'm just trying to keep up with all that and letting people know what's going on. Canada's role is modest compared to some of these countries, and when it comes to North Korea, certainly. But we did host the Vancouver Foreign Ministers meeting in January this year. Minister Kang was there, the former American Secretary of State, the Japanese foreign minister, as well as many others. And that's our contribution, to kind of highlight that unity of purpose among a bunch of countries that may not see eye to eye on every international issue, but on this one, we definitely do. And I think it's really important to highlight that message that, the U.S., Korea, Japan, and many, many others are all pushing for denuclearization, pushing for a peaceful Korean peninsula. And I think that's frankly what the people of the region want as well.
Well, international security, bilateral relations, trade ties, those are very important things. Let's talk about some fun stuff now. We've got the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics as well as the Paralympics. They've come and gone. Team Canada, of course, well represented here. Now, I have a bunch of Canadian friends in Korea, and we talked about this briefly off air, but, we're civilians. We're not diplomats like yourself, so we're allowed to talk trash to each other. And, it'd be like me going, hey, how did you guys do against the men's team in curling in the finals? Or how did the women's hockey team do in the gold medal match? And so a lot of trash talking going back and forth. And I know you are a big sports fan. And so as you kind of undertake your official role as the ambassador and meet your athletes, give support, and of course this idea of the symbol of peace and international cooperation. How difficult is it for you to separate your fanhood from being a diplomat?
Well, it's not as easy as perhaps I'd like it to be. So when you mentioned a few of the results we had against the Americans, I think if you'd told me in January that the Canadian women's team would lose the gold medal game to the American women's hockey team, and the Canadian para-hockey team would lose the gold medal game to the American para-hockey team, and our Canadian men's curling team would lose the semifinal to the American men's curling team, I would think, oh my goodness, this is going to be the least successful Olympics and Paralympics we've ever had. But instead, it turned out to be the most successful. Canadians won the most number of medals at the Olympics, Winter Olympics, that we ever had, 29. We won the most ever Paralympic winter medals that we ever have, 28. In fact, that's our previous high was 19, so it goes to show what an amazing success we had there. And the number of stories, the number of Canadians that won their first medals or that, won their third consecutive medals at the Games, it was just amazing. I had a chance to meet a lot of these athletes at the Games, at the test events that were taking place over the last 14 months. And it was such a privilege for me to be here as ambassador during this time and get a chance to be to have that role and to see all those people up close and to get a chance to meet them. And I'll never forget that.
Right. That being said, Sidney Crosby, Connor McDavid, if they were here, would have been nice, right?
Well, I mean, I'm a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. We have a very international team.
Congratulations on clinching the playoff spot for your young team, by the way.
Thanks very much. Well, we'll see. They're going to have a tough first round, but I'm wishing them the best anyway. We've only got two Canadian teams in the playoffs this year, Winnipeg and Toronto, but hopefully they can make it all the way through and maybe meet in the finals and bring the Stanley Cup back to Canada for the first time.
We've had the honor of interviewing Jim Peck as well as Sarah Murray here on this program as well. And so maybe as a final question, it really does highlight how there is that cross-cooperation, not just with diplomats and security officials and what have you, but people from all walks of life, like Jim Peck, like Sarah Murray, really kind of signifying this cooperation between the two countries. And do you think that can continue?
I think it definitely will continue. Certainly, Jim Peck is leading the Korean team to the World Championships. It's the first time the Korean hockey team is playing in that top-level World Championships group, and depending on how the playoffs go, maybe Sidney Crosby will be there, maybe Connor McDavid will be there for that, so that'll be kind of exciting. There's some dual nationals on the Korean team as well, who I think were maybe more disappointed than I was that some of the Canadian players weren't there at the Olympics. And there's just so many links between Korea and Canada that just from the number of students going back and forth, the number of Canadian teachers that come over here, the number of tourists that we have now, the number of people that watched this television show Dokgaebi a couple of years ago that was set in Quebec City. It's just an amazing and completely random sometimes connections that are made, but they're all going in a positive direction. And I would say that's one of the other big surprises. I mean, when you're a diplomat, when you're looking at things from the whole totality of the relationship, and you don't see anything that's negative. Everything is positive. Everything's going in the right direction. That's very unusual, and hopefully we can keep that going.
Hopefully we can also have you back before you unfortunately move on to your next posting. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciated your time despite your busy schedule, and best of luck.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.